All right, good morning. Wow, that was unimpressive. Let's try this again. Good morning. Excellent, well done. Thank you guys so much for coming out here. My name is Tim Medin. I am a SANS instructor. I have my own consulting company. We have the shirts that John loves. So thank you, the best shirts, quote. I'm also the SANS MSISE Program Director, INS faculty, pen tester for a long time, and yeah. So if you're curious, I am not the Big Lebowski. This is totally Fat Thor. So good deal. So let's talk through a little bit about Kerberos. So out of curiosity, who's used some Kerberoasting before? And Kerberos, wow, cool. I feel like you guys are on the wrong talk if you've done it. All right, whatever. Good deal. So Kerberos, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, it is the authentication we use in the Microsoft Windows domain. Okay, and Kerberos or Cerberus, the Greek mythology thing, is the three-headed dog that guards the gates of Hades. So protects the Windows domain, guards the gates of Hades, same thing, right? So we're going to talk through some of the basics on what Kerberos is, how it actually works, and then we'll talk through some of the basic attacks here, okay? And if you guys have questions at any point, raise your hand. I'll be happy to answer them. I'm kind of chill that way. So Kerberos, and by the way, let me back up a little bit. If you want to get the slides, they're all available at redsiege.com/kerb, so you don't have to take a picture of all the slides. It's a little bit easier. There's also the QR code. People are like, I'm not scanning your QR code. It's like, you would download the slides anyway, so, well, whatever. And it'd be the world's worst attribution, like I'm going to own you on the slide deck with like 14 different ways to contact me. That might be what we call a terrible idea. So, all right. So in Kerberos, we have that three-headed dog that guards the gates of Hades, right? In Kerberos, the authentication, we have three pieces. We have the client, right? So the user, the system that wants to perform the authentication to some sort of other system. We have what's called the KDC, the Kerberos, the Key Distribution Center, the Kerberos server. I mean, it's long story short, in Windows domain, it is the domain controller. And there's a number of other roles related to that. It's all in the domain controller, so you'll hear me say KDC, you'll hear me say DC, domain controller. Realistically, it's all that same system because it performs all of those roles. Of course, we have the member server, the target, right? I'm going to authenticate to some sort of system, right? We have this now transitive trust. I trust the KDC, that remote service trusts the KDC, and we're going to use that sort of transitive trust to perform our authentication. So in the Windows domain, there's really only one secret per account, right? And that secret is going to be the password hash, the NTLM hash, which is going to be important when it comes to some of the other attacks that we're going to talk about in a little bit. We're going to talk to the basics on how the authentication works first, and then we'll get in ways that we can attack that. So just remember, this password hash is key. It's very important here. So how does it work? Right, so I am this computer on the left, and I want to authenticate, right? I want to go into the Windows domain. I would start authenticating to systems. Think of this like going into maybe an amusement park. Right? I need a ticket to get into that music park. So I need what we call a ticket granting ticket. So I'm going to authenticate myself, say, hey, I am Tim, perform the authentication. Again, based on my password hash, there's a timestamp that's encrypted in each direction to prove that's who I am. And at that point, the domain controller, that KDC, says, okay, I trust this is who you are because you have Tim's password. And I now have the ticket that allows me into the amusement park. It allows me to go on the other rides. I'm not going on the rides yet, but I have this thing now that allows me to request the other tickets. And we're going to have this ticket granting ticket here on my screen it's orange. Up there it looks yellowish, or is it just the glasses? It is yellow. Huh, all right, whatever. So now I want to authenticate to some sort of service, Right? It could be a web server, a SQL server, a file server. It doesn't matter. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to present my ticket to the KDC once again and say, hey, this is the ride I want to go to. This is the service I want to connect to, authenticate to. So I present that granting ticket and say, let's do this. Domain controller says, let's verify this ticket granting ticket. Okay, everything looks good. Now let me give you the ticket for that service. And you can see in that response back, there's actually two pieces with that ticket. And that's going to be important when we get to one of the attacks a little bit later. The short version is there's a half I keep as the user, and there's a half that I send to that remote service. So we tear it in half. I keep this coupon, and I pass the other half to the remote service. Looks something like this. So I send it to the remote service. Now I, as the client, I have no visibility into what this ticket is. I don't know the contents of it. It's an encrypted blob. I can't see any of that. So I present this to the remote system. It then decrypts it using its one secret, right? That password hash. It decrypts it, and it gets all sorts of information about the ticket as well as me. Now, if we take a step back for a second, when I talk to the KDC to get this ticket for the service, the domain controller doesn't decide whether I should have access or not. Right? The domain controller doesn't make the decision whether I have access to the SQL server, the file server, whatever. It just presents me with this thing that says this is who Tim is. And then it lets the server decide if I have access or not. Right? And if you think about it, that's the only way it makes sense. Otherwise, the domain controller would have to know about permissions for everything. And it would be the beefiest system in your network, and it would just be this extreme bottleneck. So instead, it just gives me the ticket, and it says, look, this is who Tim is. This is Tim's driver's license. Present this now to that remote service. The service decrypts it, and then says, this is who Tim is. And it knows who I am, or presents who I am, using what's called the PAC, the Privileged Attribute Certificate. So the PAC has all sorts of information about me as the client. We can see things like, look on the right side first. I actually have it switched around. But on the right, we can see my username. Right? And the server, the target service, can make a decision. Hey, do I expect Tim to have access? Is there an account in my web server that says, look, Tim has this level of access? Additionally, we're going to have an array of the groups that I'm a member of. So I'm going to have a group, maybe I'm regular users and IT and maybe a couple of other groups. And then their member server makes the decision on whether I have access and to what level I have access based on this information, this PAC. Now to protect this PAC, well, first off, in that ticket we saw a second ago, it's already encrypted. But there's two additional signatures at the end of the PAC. The first signature is signed using the secret key for the member server, for the target server, right? So that password hash is used to encrypt this thing as well as to sign this. The second signature is a secret value, is a key that is a secret value only known by the domain controller, the KDC. Okay, so that's going to be signed using what's called the KRB TGT account. Okay, that's going to be important. We're going to come back to that in a little bit. So inside that ticket, as we mentioned, we have the PAC. But there's a half that I keep, and there's a half that I send to that remote system, right? So the half that I send to the remote system, information about me. There's the validity period. There's also a session key. Now, in the half of the ticket that I keep, I also have the same matching session key. So when the domain controller, when that KDC generates this ticket, it randomly selects a session key, and I get it, and the remote system gets it, and we can use that to establish some of our initial encrypted communication, right? So, and we also have some of the validity time here as well. Now let's take a step back here. Let's look at this picture one more time. Now, when I want to connect to that remote system, all I know is there's a web server on this particular system. Okay, there's a web server over here named Charlotte. I'm going to connect to Charlotte's web. Thank you. I'm here all week. Be sure to tip your waiter. But I want to connect to that web server. So what I do is I tell the domain controller I'm connecting to the web server on Charlotte, and then the domain controller, as we mentioned, this ticket is going to be encrypted using the password hash of the target service. I don't know that target service account, do I? I don't frankly care what it is. Of course, the domain controller needs to care, it needs to know. So it has to have a mapping. It's going to have a mapping between that service account and the service. So on Charlotte, the web server, the back-end web service might be called, I don't know, web service, right? And that's how it does the mapping to get the key, that password hash, to perform that encryption. That mapping is done with the SPN, the service principal name. That's a database for, if you will, sort of that mapping between those two pieces. So I connect to Charlotte web, it maps back to that service, it uses that service account's password hash to encrypt as well as sign, and we are then good to go. So we can see, this is how it kind of looks like. We've got Charlotte's web. We also have Cliff, the mail server. Yeah, that's a terrible one, yeah. Whatever it is, this mapping, this table is going to be known to the domain controller, and we set this mapping using set SPN. Additionally, if the service account has high enough privileges, like domain admin, which by the way is a terrible, terrible, terrible idea, we see it way too often, it can actually register itself. It can register itself in SPN. So we talked about this, alluded to these, but I want to hit on these a little bit more in depth here. In Kerberos, we have those three pieces, right? We've got the client, we've got the domain controller, that KDC, and we have the target service. Associated with each piece to prove who they are, we have their long-term keys. So the long-term key for me, the client, is of course my password hash. The long-term key for the domain controller is the password hash for the KRB TGT account, right? That's going to be important in a few different ways in a little bit. The long-term key for the target service is the password hash for that target service account, okay? So that was sort of the simple setup on how we do a Kerberos. Let's take a look at it. Let's jump in a little bit more in depth now. A little bit more crazy town, right? So we've got Eric here in the top left. And what I would need to get, this is me getting my ticket granting ticket. So I'm going to take the timestamp. I feel like a picture is missing there in the middle. Weird, whatever. So we ticket granting ticket. I'm going to request my ticket granting ticket. Before that, I'm then going to present that ticket granting ticket to the KDC. It's then going to give me the, well, it doesn't show up at all. That's weird. So there's some grayed out pieces that don't show up on the projector literally at all. Whoa. Grab the slides. Go to redteach.com/Kerb and grab the slides. I was wondering, I'm like, I feel like there's stuff missing, and there totally is. Okay. So what we've got in the top left is there's an arrow pointing down, and that's actually going to get us the password hash. That password hash is used as part of the AS rec. You can't see that. It's faded out. That's step number one. We get our AS rep, which is going to give us our ticket granting ticket. We then use the ticket granting ticket to request the ticket for the target service. Right, now, inside of that ticket granting ticket, there is also a pack that tells the information all about me. Right? And if I can create my own ticket granting ticket, what I could do is replace that pack just the same. And we'll talk about that with one of the attacks here in just a little bit. My service ticket, here's a little bit more detailed information on it. Again, there's the two pieces. Half I keep, half I send to the remote system. The remote system piece has information about who I am, my username, my SID, my group memberships, all sorts of information that the remote system can use to decide, yes, you have access, no, you don't, you have minimal access, administrative access, whatever that is. And as we mentioned, that pack is signed with 2 keys. Okay, the first key is going to be that remote system's long-term key, so the password hash of that target service. The other one is going to be, this other signature is based on the password hash for that KRB TGT account. Okay? So when that target system gets the pack, what it does is it then validates the long-term key, right? It knows its own password hash, which means it can check the signature of the pack and say, cool, this pack looks good. Additionally, sometimes, depending on the configuration of the service, it will say, you know what, I need a second set of eyes. I need something else to double check this pack because I just want to be sure. In that case, what it can do is it can actually send the pack to the domain controller and say, hey, can you check out the signature for me? Because remember, there were 2 signatures, right? The first used the password hash of the target service. The second uses the password hash for KRB TGT, and only the domain controller knows that. So when does this happen? If the service is set to run, quote, run as part of the operating system, that's actually a setting, it will not ask the domain controller, oh my God, is that a terrifying costume, Dave? Holy, dude, I need new pants. Okay. So, that is so distracting. Okay, so where the hell was I? What were we talking about? Oh, the pack, right? So we get the pack. We send the pack to the remote system. Kate's taking a picture, so I'm going to point with this. So we're going to send that pack to the target. To the domain controller. It'll perform that secondary validation. Okay. Of course, that means additional latency, right? Because there's an additional back and forth where I have to take the ticket, now send it to the domain controller, wait for the domain controller to check the signature, and then wait for a response. Imagine if you had that additional latency for, I don't know, SQL requests, right? That would not fly. So for example, a SQL service, the SQL engine is set by default to, quote, run as part of the operating system. Meaning when it gets the pack, it will check the first signature using its password hash, but it does not perform the second check. Okay, and that's going to be important for one of the attacks we'll talk about in a little bit. For example, though, a web server will always do this secondary validation. It's because the way the app pools are set up, it will use its own password hash, validate the first signature, send the pack to the KDC, the domain controller, to perform the secondary validation, and then we'll continue on. Okay? You guys tracking so far on how Kerberos works? Good deal. 3 of you. Fantastic. All right, whatever. So now let's start breaking this, right? How can we use this knowledge to our advantage if we can get some of these passwords, or can we crack some of these passwords? The first we're going to take a look at is what's called the golden ticket. So the golden ticket, remember those 3 long-term keys we talked about. My password hash, the target service's password hash, and that password hash for KRB TGT. If I can get that KRB TGT password hash, what I can do now is I can create my own ticket granting tickets, right? It's sort of like I'm now a forger of driver's license. I can make my own driver's license, I can have the hologram on it, and I can be anybody that I want to. So if I can get that now, I can start to rewrite and create my own ticket granting ticket. So what's going to happen here, and I think this is not going to show up because of the projector, I'm going to skip the first steps. I no longer need to talk to the domain controller and say, hey, look, I need a ticket granting ticket. Instead, I'd be like, bro, I already got one. And I'm going to send my ticket granting ticket, the one that I have forged and I have signed using the password hash of KRB TGT. I'm going to send that to the domain controller Domain controller is going to look at it and be like, cool, that's my signature, and then use that pack in the subsequent tickets. Okay, so we're going to skip those first steps. So we'll talk about some of the mitigations here in a little bit, but now because I create my own pack, I can be anybody. I can be the domain administrator. I can add any group memberships that I want. I can use fake usernames. So I'm going to have accounts that are going to show up in the log that don't actually exist. The sky is the limit now because I can now forge those tickets, right? So why is this special, right? Because again, it's an escalation. It's also a persistence mechanism. I can create these tickets and now I can become anybody. So it's a very, very powerful. So what we need to do is, of course, be extremely careful with this KRB TGT account, right? We don't, of course, want someone to get access to that. I remember when I first heard about this golden ticket attack, and I was like, I don't see how this is useful. Because to get the password hash for KRB TGT, I have to compromise the entire domain. And if I've compromised the entire domain, why do I care if I can compromise the entire domain again in a different way? The key here, no pun intended, is the persistence aspect. And I can now become anybody that I want and forge a lot of those tickets. Additionally, I can create tickets that are valid for a very long period of time. By default, the tools will create tickets that are valid for 10 years. So if you see a ticket that's now valid for 10 years, you probably have a problem. You have someone on your network. Now, how can we create the ticket? We can use a tool like Mimikatz. So off to the top left here, we're using Mimikatz. We're going to give it the password hash for KRB TGT. Because when it generates that pack, it needs to sign that pack. It's actually going to sign it twice using that same key. And then we've got our ticket granting ticket. Now we want to authenticate to some sort of a target system. That forged ticket granting ticket will be sent to the domain controller. We get a ticket for that target service using our forged pack. And because we've probably set the right permissions, we can now access that target service as whomever we want to. Okay? So then we load our ticket, and then we start using our ticket. Another sort of fun thing, once you've already compromised the domain, is what's called the skeleton key. What the skeleton key does is it runs on a domain controller. It's a shim, if you will. And what happens is when someone performs the authentication, we talked about it uses the password hash of that user to say, hey, that's Tim. The password hash that he's sending matches what I've got. Cool, we're good to go. What the skeleton key does is we set another password. And when the domain controller checks, it says, okay, let's try this password. All right, this password doesn't match. This is not Tim. He sent a bad password. What the skeleton key does is it allows anyone to authenticate using a secondary password. And the default password, I think, is Mimikatz. I forget what it was. Anybody remember? Yeah, it's the password of Mimikatz. So I can authenticate as any user to the DC using the password Mimikatz, and I'll get back a valid account. Now, from a pen test perspective, be extremely careful. Right now, you have exposed this domain controller to everybody. Anybody that authenticates with this password now will be granted a ticket. I was talking to Rob Fuller, Mubix. He said he was doing a pen test, and he just tried to authenticate as a random user as Mimikatz, and it worked. So what had happened is a previous pen test company had come in, used the skeleton key, and they forgot to remove it. To remove it, you have to simply reboot the domain controller, and they never did. So that meant for the past year, anybody could authenticate as any user using this skeleton key password, which by default is Mimikatz. So if you use it, you have to clean up. It is completely unsafe to do anything otherwise. But a very, very ingenious attack. How can we do this? Once again, Mimikatz. So I'm going to run Mimikatz on the target service. We're going to load the skeleton key and then shim the authentication service. Let's talk about my favorite, Kerberoasting. So I would happily talk to you about Kerberoasting for hours and hours and hours. Hold on. Thanks, bud. So Kerberoasting. So remember, that target service account is encrypted using the that service ticket is encrypted using the password hash of the target service. So what I can do is I can request a ticket for a service. And I can then guess a password, turn it into the hash, and attempt to decrypt. And if it doesn't work, I guess hash decrypt, guess hash decrypt, guess hash decrypt, guess hash decrypt, over and over and over and over again until maybe I get lucky. So what it allows me to do is now do an offline password attack against any service account inside the organization. It's an offline attack, which means there's no lockout. You don't see me guessing. The only thing you see is the request for the service ticket. Now remember from earlier, when I request that service ticket, the domain controller does not make any decisions. The domain controller does not decide, hey, wait, is Tim supposed to have access to the SQL server? Is Tim supposed to have access to the file server? Right? The file server and the SQL server make that decision. So I can request a ticket for anything, things that I will definitely not have permission to, but I can request that service ticket. So I can request a large quantity of these, do that offline cracking of these service accounts, and then maybe, find a new password, right? How cool is that? Let's take a little deeper look into what that kind of looks like. So because at this point in time, if we look back at our authentication, at no point in time am I actually talking to the target service, right? Ticket granting ticket, who am I talking to? The domain controller. When I get the service ticket, who am I talking to? Domain controller. So I can request tickets for services that are firewalled off. I can request tickets for services where the system is powered off or offline. I can request a service ticket for these service accounts where the system has been removed from service, deprecated, thrown in a dumpster, or sent out for recycling. As long as that SPN mapping that we talked about earlier, as long as that still exists, I can request that ticket. So I can get a large number of these tickets, perform the offline cracking attacks, and maybe win. Now, service accounts, sort of prior to this attack, people were like, oh, SQL service account. No one's authenticating directly to the SQL service account. It's not used anywhere except the SQL server, so who cares, right? How often do you guys change service account passwords? The answer is like, I don't know, never, right? Except for a couple of you who are like, YOLO, let's do it on a Friday before a holiday. Right? No one changes these things, which means this offline cracking attack for a real adversary, they could let this thing run for, literally years, right? And maybe have luck cracking the password. So what I need to do is get that ticket, extract the ticket, and then perform my crack. So we can use things like invoke mimikatz to extract this from PowerShell Empire. Initially, when I first developed this technique, I wrote my own cracker. Anybody else try to do that before? Yes, smart people, smarter than me. So I tried to write a cracker. How many of you have tried to use like multi-core and multi-threading things inside of code? Yeah, how many of you regretted that life decision relatively quickly? Yeah, so I was gonna be like all high tech. I had built this queue to take the word list and like put it into this big queue, and then there was gonna pop off the queue, and I was using multi-core and multi-threads to do the cracking so that it would be like optimized for speed. And then I sent it over. The first person that tried this in the wild was Ethan Robish from Black Hills, like 9 months before we talked about this attack at DerbyCon. He's like, man, this works really well. I'm like, awesome. He's like, I used your cracker. I'm like, cool. How did it work? He's like, well, and there was an option to set the number of threads for speed. And I'm like, how many threads was optimal? And I'm thinking, is it like number of cores +1, number of cores -1? Is there some other factor? And while I'm thinking, he's like, 1. I'm like, one what? Like one thread. So literally my attempt to make it faster and use more processors actually slowed the entire friggin' thing down. So yeah, don't use my cracker, use Hashcat or John the Ripper. Okay? So this allows me to get now that password hash for that remote system. Once I have the password hash for the remote system, remember that pack is signed using the password hash of the remote system. So I can regenerate the pack, I can sign it using the password hash of that target service. It will then, of course, decrypt the ticket using that same password hash. It will check the signature using the same password hash and be like, awesome, everything is good. Let's let Tim in, right? And so I can now forge the ticket for that target system. So we've got, as we saw before, we've got the pack there, the signature. Remember, there's two signatures, the signature for the target service, and then also the signature using KRB TGT. Now, of course, unless I have the KRB TGT, I can't successfully forge that. But remember, there are some service accounts who are not going to verify the second signature. So I may not even need to deal with that in the first place. For example, a SQL server by default will not check that target, that second signature, so I'm ready to rock and roll. Right? Other attacks using Kerberos. It's called, I can use pass the ticket. I mean, this isn't really super high tech. It's, I have access as another user. I just use that other user's ticket, right? It's like I steal a driver's license for somebody else to get into the bar. And now I just use that driver's license, that ticket, to access those additional systems. What does that look like? Once again, Mimikatz. So I can extract the service from a ticket from another system, move it someplace else, re-inject that ticket into memory, and then start authenticating as that other user. Right? And other additional details here. We also have the overpass the hash. Again, very similar to what we were just talking about here. What I can do is, even if we have NTLM auth disabled, I can still request the TGT using the password hash, right? Because that's how we authenticate with Kerberos. I can then request the TGT, and I can perform all of the authentication. Okay? So now let's talk about some of the defenses. So we've got the attacks and defenses. And well, let's talk about the attack side first. When can we use each one of these attacks? So up first, golden ticket. I can only use the golden ticket after I have the access to the domain controller. Okay? And it's used for persistence and for pivoting. It is not a technique you're going to use to get initial access. It is not a technique that's going to allow you to do your initial pivoting. This is, once I have the whole kingdom, now I'm going to hold on tight to that kingdom. We have Kerberoasting. All I need with Kerberoasting is access as a single user. So I pop a single account. A single user clicks on that phishing email. A single compromised account. And we can now Kerberos, where I can request the ticket and perform the offline cracking. Silver ticket. This requires the service hash, the target service hash. So I can use this after I Kerberos, or maybe I compromise a system and I can get that password hash in another way. And again, this is persistent, but for a particular service. The pass the hash and the overpass the hash, what this allows me to do is then pivot. I have access as a user. Let's start using that user elsewhere. I can't impersonate other users. I can't make that user appear to have more permissions than they actually do. But I can now use that to start moving throughout the network. Now, obviously, to prevent these attacks, it's kind of difficult, right? Like you just say, oh, well, don't get compromised. Yeah, good luck with that, right? I mean, you know, that's sort of obvious, but when these bad things happened, then what? Right? When your KRB TGT account is compromised, then what? The key is going to be monitoring. In security, we love to talk about defenses. We love to talk about protections, way to prevent the attacker to get in. That's only half the story, at best. They're going to get in, right? That's going to happen. We have to be able to monitor. According to the Verizon breach report, how long are bad guys in our networks before we finally figure it out? 6 months, right? 6 months the bad guys are in our networks before we figure it out. So monitoring is key, because the protections will fail. So we need to also rely on the detections. How can we detect some of these attacks? Golden ticket. I need to look for requests using a ticket granting ticket where there was no request for said ticket granting ticket, right? That requires additional tooling where I need to correlate and say, hey, look, Tim requested a ticket granting ticket, and then he used that ticket granting ticket to request access to a service. Cool, I have correlation. But if all of a sudden somebody else shows up and like, hey, I am now Ed, can I get a ticket for this service? Like, whoa, whoa, whoa. Ed, you never asked for a ticket granting ticket. You are not following the rules, right? So we need to do some of the monitoring, some of the behavioral analytics to identify this. Kerberoasting. If all of a sudden you have a user on the network requesting tickets for everything, you have a problem. So look for a large number of ticket requests. Now, I as the attacker know this, and I want to go low and slow. Instead, maybe I ask for a single ticket, right? Much harder to monitor. Find that single needle in a haystack, right? The key here is going to be going back to the behavior. Why all of a sudden is Steve in marketing or Sally in accounting requesting access to a SQL server? That's atypical. That is not normal. That is something that needs to be followed up on. So that monitoring piece here is going to be very, very key. Similar with that silver ticket, right? We're skipping steps and we're going straight to that target service. Okay, with that, we're going to wrap up the talk. You want the slides down here. Questions? Yes, sir. Shout it out. I'll repeat it. So the question is, do I ever recommend rotating the KRB TGT? Yes, but usually after a compromise. So let's talk back. So we talked about those three long-term keys, right? I can rotate a password hash for my account relatively simply. I can rotate the service account kind of simply, maybe during a maintenance window. That KRB TGT account, it is everything with Kerberos relies upon that. So if you break that piece, all of Kerberos breaks, which means your domain goes bye-bye. So what you have to do is we have to actually rotate that password twice. There's a longer story there. Short version is you can use the current password hash as well as the previous one, because that's how it allows you to rotate. Otherwise, you would rotate and it would immediately destroy everything. So if you rotate twice, very, very quickly, you break the entire domain. So if you rotate, you have to rotate slow enough that the update propagates and nothing breaks. So the question, going back to the original question, do I recommend rotating the KRB TGT? Only recommendations I've ever seen is after a breach or after a compromise. I have not seen recommendations to do it like on a daily basis or anything. Yeah. And I've seen bad guys that will routinely hit that account and try to like, hey, has it changed? Has it changed? Has it changed? And if it does, they'll start pulling that thing and they'll stay up with it anyway. So cool, other questions? Yes, sir, shout really loud. Yeah, so his question is, when I do Kerberoasting, if I play the low and slow and I request a single ticket, isn't that hard to detect? Absolutely it is. The key here is, if I as the attacker land on someone in accounting's network, right? Why are they all of a sudden asking for a ticket for a database server, right? So in that case, we look for the differentiation. They're not supposed to be asking for this ticket. This is the piece that we look for. So it's a different one, and don't get me wrong, that itself, that too is quite difficult. Yeah, yeah. Great, other questions? Yes, sir, really loud. Yeah, so the encryption on the ticket, it can use RC4. RC4 is faster for our cracking. We can also use AES. One of the detection mechanisms for things like Kerberoasting is someone requesting a ticket and saying, hey, use RC4 instead of AES. Now, I as the attacker know that, so I can request the AES ticket if I so choose to blend in better. It just takes a lot longer to crack. Yeah, you definitely don't want to allow RC4 in your environment if you can, but there's ways I can force the RC4, so it goes back to that monitoring piece. Look for RC4. Cool. Yes, sir. Recommended password length for service accounts, that's sort of a religious debate. I mean, as long as it's random, people say the minimum should be 15 characters, right? I mean, some people say 20, 25. Realistically, we don't want it crackable in our lifetime. And if it's random and it's 15 characters, that should be plenty good. Go higher if you can. I mean, at that point, you're probably not going to store it locally, so just go, sky's the limit, right? Doesn't matter. Yes, sir. So his question is, what techniques do I use to request tickets? I have some scripts that I wrote, kind of old school a little bit. Impacket is a great one. You can just manually authenticate to the service and let it do the ticket, quote unquote, nicely. I love me some Impacket. Cool, other questions? So his question is, with Kerberos, at the very beginning we mentioned that this Microsoft version is a bastardized version of the MIT Kerberos. The bastard in this is, with the MIT Kerberos, the secrets, those keys, are randomly generated. With Kerberos, we're using the password hashes, right? So the KRB TGT account, you are never going to brute force that, right? You are not in all of our collective lifetimes going to brute force that. The service account, because a human said it, if they picked a bad password, I could, of course, crack that. So the devil in this detail is the choice of the key. Because it's based on the password hash, that's the critical weakness with things like Kerberoasting. Great. All right, thank you guys so much. Feel free to stop by the booth. We'll chat some more, but thanks for coming.